Thank you very much, Peter, for the introduction. So I would like to talk about future internet research infrastructures. Now, if you think about the internet, well, initially it was transferring bits and bytes, ones and zeros. And that's where TCP/IP was developed for. Now, in the meantime, the internet has evolved a lot and is much more than just transferring bits and bytes. It has to do with the fact that you work with people, that you offer them new services, you offer them new interfaces, new ways of working, new ways of interacting, and you have to support this, all these new developments also by a research infrastructure. And I will give you some examples where we are today in order to explain you what exactly it means, these types of future internet research infrastructure, because I think they may be less common to people here in the audience. First example, if you look at developments currently going on internet research, you have the developments on novel networks, novel cloud technologies, novel content distribution systems, novel security technologies, denial of service systems. And one example of an infrastructure which is located in our facilities is a centralized facility. It looks very simple. You may think it's just a grid computer or a small part of a high-performance computer, but actually it consists of 100 servers with a special dedicated switch, screens for interaction, input-output of what you do, and that's it in terms of hardware. But what is offered to the user is he can do research in networking, in cloud, in content, in security. A similar infrastructure, but fully distributed with a nice model, where I briefly explain, is Planet Lab. Planet Lab actually has also a number of servers distributed all over Europe, actually all over the world. But if we talk about Planet Lab Europe, it's European infrastructure. And as you can see, all these European stars you see all over Europe, the model is each university, research institute, brings in 2 servers, fully gives the control to Planet Lab Europe, so there is no firewall in between. It's fully connected to Planet Lab Europe, and if you give them, you can also access all the other ones, facilities, and do your experiments. So it's a very sustainable model. Everybody just brings in internet access and the 2 servers, and people can use it. And of course, the GA and the NRANs play an important role because they are interconnecting all these infrastructures. Now, there is also the whole wireless world in internet. You have wireless access, like the wireless LAN systems. You have the mobility, like the 3G, the LTE systems. You have the Internet of Things, where you have all sensors, actuators spread out over the world. Again, you have different types of infrastructures. One of them is very centralized, very controlled environments where you can do experiments. You see here an example of a large office building with about 400 nodes which you can use. Or it can be spread out over a city. Here is Smart Santander project, and Santander is one of the sites, of course, where you have a lot of sensors which you can access, and you can develop new services and new applications on top of that. You can measure temperature, noise, parking places which are empty, so many types of measurements you can do. So that's the real Internet of Things which is happening in terms of infrastructure. Now this is all supported from the FIRE unit in the DG INFSO, the Future Internet Research and Experimentation. And there you have networking testbeds, you have service testbeds, and the support of doing novel experiments on these infrastructures from different user communities. Just to give a few examples of these FIRE projects, well, the first example is the Bonfire project. It's dealing with new cloud technologies. So this is what Mario Campolargo was talking about, ICT research infrastructure to develop new ICT technologies. So this is a type of infrastructure we talk about. Bonfire, they bring together a number of these facilities spread over Europe. They break the boundaries, bring it together, and offer it to their experimenters. So the people that want to do experiments on these infrastructures. And you have similar projects running at this moment. For example, Ophelia is dealing with the so-called software-defined networks. So it's a real paradigm shift in networking where people will be able to develop, depending on what application they have, specific networking protocols inside the network. So this Ophelia project is offering this now and to its users. Similar developments in wireless, cognitive radio networks is a CREW project, and the Open Lab is bringing together Internet of Things together with wireless networking, together with distributed server infrastructures. Now, this program started about 5 years ago, so I would say it's young, and we have heard a lot that it takes a long time before you have really established a research infrastructure. So this is really, I think, the one which is the youngest in what we have heard so far. And in the different calls, about 110 million euro was spent in order to do, on one hand, building up research infrastructure, on the other hand, stimulating to do experiments on these research infrastructures. So, of course, we have the coordination and support actions. We have 12 different research facilities that have been built up over the years. And then you have about 16 projects dealing with doing experiments on all of these facilities. So this is the current status. So where are we today? Many small and medium-sized future internet research facilities. There is a large focus on networking-related infrastructures and less on services and applications. And this is now moving. So we see more and more also in this area providing infrastructures. You have seen in the project, similar infrastructure are getting interconnected and people get a uniform access to these infrastructures. And we see a large number of experiments going on. We don't talk about 40 million users. No, it's much smaller numbers. But you talk about thousands of experiments going on certain infrastructures. Some are less. Why? Because some of these infrastructures are very focused. So they cover a smaller range of research. But they are not less important than the other ones. Because if you think about cognitive radio networking, it's not a very big community, but it's a very important development that one should support. There's a strong involvement of universities and research institutes, and in some research infrastructure you also see already a large involvement of industry. And I would say, talking from our own experience at IBBT, there is also a great potential to have SMEs involved, because it's very important for them to have access to these facilities because they cannot develop them on their own. The bigger companies typically have part of this developed in their own facilities, but for smaller companies it's very important. Where do we want to be in 2020? Well, first of all, from the experimenter's point of view, he has to be able to focus on his experiment. He has to be able to develop the next generation internet technologies. So this should be the focus. So he should have access to a wide range of experiments. The facilities should be there. He should be able to access seamless multiple facilities on different sites to set up complex experiments. He has to get access to a single powerful tool chain covering the whole experiment lifecycle. We'll come back to that a little bit later. And essentially, he has to be supported in a systematic experimental approach, which is, I would say, in this community is still lacking. I mean, people are too much trying something, but not really going into the real ways of you have to do an experiment. So we have to teach them in doing it in a much more systematic approach, and therefore we have to give them the tools. And finally, of course, an experimenter should have a low entry barrier, and this should be also the case for industry. Now, from a facility provider perspective, so the people who develop these research infrastructures, well, they have to focus on the real added value of their facility, be it the most advanced cognitive radio network, being the most advanced cloud infrastructure to do experiments, and the more general services that have to be offered, like access control, user control, measurement tools that could be more generic, well, they have to be developed as a common platform. So that will give them more functionality. They need more and better documentation, which is still quite a problem. They should increase the support, because today it's very difficult in a number of these infrastructures to have real support. If you want to do an experiment, you have to be an expert yourself. There is not enough support available. And if you do that, you will have a larger customer base to build on, which is also important. And it's very important that these providers start thinking of getting it really in Europe, so providing a pan-European federation. And all of this should lead to sustainable infrastructure, both from a technical and a financial point of view. Now, if you look at the future, And Horizon 2020, this gives you a bit more detailed what we have heard before by Mario. So the three major challenges is creating industrial leadership, excellence in science, and tackling societal challenges. Well, actually, fire infrastructures should deal with all these different challenges. Why? Because it's for excellence in science very important to develop the next generation infrastructures. Industry needs them because they have to do innovation to come up with new products. And since the internet is really a foundation of many technical society challenges, it's very important to develop it further. How to get there? Well, that's where we were. That's where we are today. Now, what we have to do in future, we have to break these boundaries between the different facilities. We have to focus on supporting the experimenter, and we have to bring all these facilities together and federate them in order to give the user an access which is really very much supportive. So there is the user, and we have to support that user. The infrastructure should be very flexible. Why? I will show you one example later. The needs are very dynamic. So at a certain point in time, we need to have easily plugged in new infrastructures and easily remove older ones which we cannot use anymore. And since they are very diverse, we have to have the right tools to do that. Now let's have a look at its experimental life cycle, which is from the experimenter point of view. The first thing to find out as an experimenter is what are the resources I can do experiments on. And this is becoming more and more complex. So he has to have easy access to discover the resources, and we have heard this already in previous talks. Then in the case of this future internet research infrastructure, he has to be able to reserve that. You may think, well, that should be easy, that should be there. No, it's not. And provisioning should be automatic. It should not be a cumbersome interface which you have to program. This should be much easier. And then when he has the infrastructure he needs available, then he has to control his experiment. He has to have the support to control it, to monitor what he is doing, and to do specific measurements which he needs for his experiment. And when the experiment is done, he has to be supported in the evaluation. The analysis, interpretation of the results, comparison with other results of other people who have done experiments. And all of this has to be done in a trustworthiness environment, something which is also still missing today because there was not much emphasis on that in the past, but if you really want to integrate all of this, this is becoming very important. And here we can learn a lot from other infrastructures. Just think about the EGI, where we have a number of these problems which have been solved. The provider, what he has to do, first of all, make that his infrastructure is excellent, is really top state of the art. But then he has to develop all the gear in his infrastructure to support the experimenter. That's being resource descriptions. Well, I give a few of them, but they can become quite complex because you see more and more that people are involved as a resource in an infrastructure. So how to describe people in a resource? That's one example. Then you have to do the provisioning. So once I have defined what experiment I want to do as an experimenter, the infrastructure should support the mapping of this on the resources that are available. Do the reservation to the activation. One has to have the full experiment control, and this should be provided by the infrastructure providers. So the workflows have to be there. You should be able to inject events, change parameters, use standard templates for certain experiments, combine them, and set up complex workflows. And then, of course, very essential, if you do not monitoring what you're doing, you cannot do anything with your experiment. So all these tools have to be provided. And this is not on a single infrastructure basis. So this is one cloud, for example. No, they have to provide interface to the outside world. Networking, wireless, fixed, all they have to provide this interface. And then you have to build on top of that federation of all these infrastructures. And this federation actually has to implement the tools where people can find out what resources to use over all the infrastructures. Reserve it. Do the experiment control over these complex federated infrastructures and do the measuring of the whole thing. And this in a trusted environment. And once we have this, and this is not there, this is something that has to be developed, then we can really offer to our experimenters what he really needs, this experimental lifecycle support. And this very important both for industry and for the academic world. Now let me nearly finish by giving you one example that it's really very dynamic. And I'm sure that many of you have seen this picture recently because it has been in the press over the last few weeks. This is the Google glasses. What's this? Well, you have a camera and you have a display, and that's your interface. You don't have to carry anymore your screen, your keyboard. And if you combine this with recent developments like we see in gaming, so the Microsoft gaming engine, you see these kids playing, but they don't have any infrastructure, nothing with them. They just interface with their environment, but it's the environment who has all the intelligence. Now, this is a real shift in terms of future internet research infrastructure. You need to test these new paradigms, because what you say now, as a user, actually, I don't have infrastructure necessarily with me. It's just the environment I'm interfacing with, the internet. And therefore, again, we need to develop new software paradigms, new technologies to do that, and all the supporting infrastructures. So to conclude, well, FIRE in 2020, well, it should be the platform for future internet experimentation. And I think European Commission should stimulate projects to use the platform. Why? What you see today in many projects, they are developing their own small infrastructure, and that's exactly the way our PhD students worked 10 years ago. They built up their own little facility, 5 servers, 2 wireless access points, and each PhD student again did the same thing. And that's what you still see in projects. So future, maybe it would be a good choice that if you want to do an experiment in a project, if it's not available, you may have to develop your infrastructure, but it's available, one has to stimulate to use this pan-European infrastructure. And this should be a federated facility, as I mentioned, supporting a wide range of experiments, the full experimental life cycle, and the trustworthiness. Flexible to include new technologies, structured support for the experimenter, training and education is very important. We heard that Janet also mentioned it in the speech before. It's very important to train and educate people how to do useful experiments. We need an increased use by industry, especially SMEs. And I think if you look at the model which was also presented by IMEC, there you have seen there are large infrastructures. So you have seen in Europe there are about 4 to 5 large infrastructures. I think also in future internet research, we need to have a hierarchy of infrastructure. Very large ones which have many capabilities on large scale, but also smaller and then micro infrastructure where the seeds are built for the next generation infrastructure. So this will be very important. And there should be a balance between European, national, and industry funding. And we should not forget also the involvement of the smaller countries. It's a great opportunity for smaller countries also to participate here. So I see I still have 1 minute, therefore I will take one last slide. We also have to be very careful about the competition of Europe and the outside world. Of course, we should think global, but we have to be very careful. And I just want to ask you one question. And if I would ask the question to the microelectronics people, what if you would have $1 billion, they would say we build a 450 millimeter clean room. Now what happens in the US, it was very recently announced, in terms of future internet research infrastructure, what would you do with $1 billion? You would build a new city. What would that city be? And it has been announced in May, in the middle of New Mexico. It would be a host city. There will be no people inside the city, but they would support a broad range of new experiments to be done for future internet. The most nice one, of course, is the self-flushing toilets. Thank you.